aware about what's going on the front lines as far as, because I've heard some people say now the death toll for Ukrainians is shooting through the roof compared to what's going on in Russia. Can you give us some insight to what's actually going on the front line that kind of pushes back against this narrative from Anthony Blinken, from Zelensky? Because I keep on believing they keep on saying like, oh, we've captured this town. And I'm not sure because I can't, my Ukrainian is not up to par, but it seems like they're doing the same thing when they said, oh, we killed the number 2 ISIS leader. I'm like, I thought you did that like 3 times. I think like sometimes they're saying they're recapturing these small towns, these small pockets, like, oh, they already recaptured that. You're repeating it again to make it sound like Ukraine is actually having success in this counteroffensive. Go ahead.
Well, first thing we have to understand is this counteroffensive has been months in the planning. Back in October, General Zaluzhny, the senior commander of Ukrainian forces, went to what's called the Ramstein Contact Group in Ramstein to make a pitch for billions of dollars more. Because remember, the United States already provided that initial tranche of $45 billion back in May that built a Ukrainian military of 80,000 that launched this counteroffensive against Kharkov and the Kherson region. And they were somewhat successful, but they were all killed, wounded, destroyed, gone. Whatever was left of them died in Bakhmut during the fighting in March, April, and May of this year. Very violent fighting. He said he needed 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, unlimited ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of debate in NATO who's going to provide what, da-da-da. But the bottom line is NATO did pony up this equipment. And NATO did train around 37,000 Ukrainian forces outside of NATO that were then outside of Ukraine that were then brought back in. Another 20,000 were trained inside Ukraine to man this equipment. So that's about 60,000 troops. In addition to that, in the vicinity of Bakhmut, where that heavy fighting was, Ukraine built up another 8 brigades worth, another 40,000 troops to launch an attack there. So 100,000 Ukrainians were mobilized specifically for this counteroffensive. The counteroffensive began around June 4th. The main axis of advance was in southern Zaporizhia. On your map, it's where the box is. That little blue pocket at the top there is in the vicinity of a village called Robotyno. Now, that blue pocket's actually interesting because all that blue pocket represents is low ground. Now, imagine the brown terrain surrounding it. That's all high ground. So what the Russians did is build defensive barriers in that blue ground, consisting of minefields, trenches, ambushes, etc. And then on the high ground, they dug in their main defensive line. So the Ukrainians have spent the last 3 months dying in the low ground, rushing into the Russian minefields, getting blown up, getting slaughtered. In Bakhmut, they're doing the same thing. They're launching attacks in Bakhmut up there where it says held by Russia, just a little angle up. You'll see the term Bakhmut. They're launching counterattacks there, using those 40,000 troops. So of the 100,000 troops right now, as of September 10th, 71,000 of them are casualties. That doesn't mean they're all dead, but it means they're either dead, they're wounded, they're crippled, they're blind, they're out of combat. 71,000 out of the 100,000 are gone, along with all of their equipment. In the city of Poltava in Ukraine, the military commissar responsible for mobilization has come out and said, out of every 100 men that we mobilized, 80 to 90 of them are gone.
Jeez.
80 to 90 are gone. This is what's happening here. And people want to somehow believe that this is a success. The Russians have given up trivial amounts of land. The Ukrainians had not reached the first line of defense. Remember, after the first line of defense is the second line of defense, and the third line of defense, and the fourth line of defense. The Ukrainians haven't reached the first line of defense. They're still in the forward defensive area, what I call the crumple zone, designed to absorb the attack, and they've lost everything. Yeah. This war is over. Ukraine is done. They can't accomplish what they say they need to accomplish. Again, going to that box shows the axis of advance, the ideal axis of advance. So you go from that blue pocket, you go down south. There's a village called Tokmak. They were supposed to have captured that 2 months ago. They have not come back. Their final objective is Mariupol at the bottom. Melitopol, at the bottom there. They were supposed to capture Melitopol, and that would sever the land bridge to the parts that held by Russia, that's continental part. Going down further south is Crimea. You sever the land bridge, you isolate Crimea, and you have the fantasy of recapturing Crimea. This was the goal. This is why they built up these forces. They haven't come close to accomplishing that. They are stuck in the low ground near Robotyno, being slaughtered by the Russians.
And for all you out there, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever see the movie The Rock, the SEALs come up from underneath the ground. They're going to try to go back and take the away from the Marines. Ed Harris had them, and they saw them coming, and all the Marines were up on top, and all the SEALs were trying to come up from the bottom, and Ed Harris told them, like, we have you. We're on an elevated ground. It almost sounds like what you're talking about over here, that this is the low ground in which they're trapped and there's no way for them to go. You said the absorption zone. Is that what you're kind of referring to over there, where the Russians are so... Because, you know, Scott, there's this argument out there, there was this narrative that was put out in the beginning of this war, that the Russian military is just a bunch of sloppy idiots. They're not trained well. The Ukrainians have had, you know, Blackwater training them, and a lot of weaponry, and they're much harsher fighters. I mean, can you provide a little insight to that when you talk about this high ground and this low ground, this absorption zone?
Well, what's important to note is that this defensive barrier here is representative. It's standard. It's an adaptation of standard Soviet defensive doctrine that has been in part of the Russian military since the end of the Second World War. But it was adapted when the Russians went into Ukraine early on. And they began fighting the Ukrainians. I think everybody realized that everything people thought they knew about modern war, throw it away. That modern war is far more lethal, far more dangerous, far more bloody and violent than anybody had imagined. It's not me saying that. General Christopher Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, spoke at Oslo in January to a NATO defensive forum, and he said just that. The scope and scale of the violence is beyond our imagination. We couldn't consider what is going on here. If you can't imagine it, you can't prepare for it. And so even Russia, I think, was taken a little aback on it. Doesn't mean that they're bad soldiers. The Russians are very adaptable. There was a general named Alexander Romanchuk, and he was the deputy commander of the 58th Combined Armed Army that was doing a lot of fighting down there in the Zaporizhia area. He was pulled out of the fighting and sent to the Combined Arms Academy, where he rethought Russian defensive warfare, reconceptualized it, and he wrote a new manual. He actually published an article, which I read about it. He explains this. And it redefined Russian defensive doctrine. And then they pulled him out of the academy, and they put him in charge of building the defense. Guess where? Right there, right in that box. He's the man who built the defense. And it is, and even General Miley, all the Americans are going, wow, this is a pretty good defense. We can't crack this defense. Why? Because the Russians are pretty damn good at what they do.
Yeah.